Last night was the first time that we had performed Hamlet, Prince of Cuba in Spanish, and we are just fresh out of a performance full of students, a student matinee that we did in Spanish as well. And I sort of asked this on stage for the students a little bit, but by doing this in Nilo Cruz's Spanish, what changed for you? What was unique or different about doing Shakespeare in Spanish this time from last night compared to not necessarily doing it?
Well, Shakespeare is hard to translate in Spanish, so it doesn't matter who the playwright is. Shakespeare writes in iambic pentameter, which is your heartbeats, and Nilo does an amazing translation of that. The usage of the words that Nilo uses are extremely hard and elaborate, and are words that you don't use in a regular day-to-day Spanish conversation with somebody. So just wrapping your head around the elaborate phrases and words was a challenge, even to me, a native Spanish speaker.
Well, I feel, and it is very poetic. To me, I've done Lorca in Spanish. It reminded me a lot of Lorca because what I find is he's lyrical and like he tried to have it have a classical flavor, but at the same time it's so immediate because you lose the iambic, so you lose the poetry in a way, but you gain the prose, so it becomes contemporary. And what I discovered last night was, oh my God, we're doing a black comedy. Hamlet is a black comedy. It's not a tragedy at all. Because there's something about doing it in another language and getting it out of its corset that releases the humor in it, and it's wildly funny. I mean, here we are in the bedroom scene where I have to be horrified of what he's done, but Shakespeare has written so many funny lines for Hamlet, like, oh well, farewell, you know, you were intrusive. And in Spanish, there's this whole expression, Nilo has said, este lenguaraz está muy calladito. You know, this big mouth guy is really quiet and still now, and it's
And
funny.
Shakespeare says, he does a pun on the word grey. He says, this counselor is most still and grey, because he's dead, who was in life a foolish prating knave. That's the joke he gives him over the dead body.
Right.
So, and Nilo found an exact kind of equivalent of that.
He did. And for some reason, maybe in English in his time, they would have thought that was hilarious. In our time, it's like, ooh, it's Hamlet, and there's a little reverence.
Hamlet is constantly telling jokes.
He is.
And that is what has been released in Frankie's performance in English and Spanish.
Absolutely. I was going to say, we had, a funny time doing that last scene in the rehearsals with your line of, why not, my lord? I'm going to drink. In Spanish, it's a totally different context. Yeah, it's like, why should I not drink?
Why should I not drink? Well, and the Spaniards were always cutting up laughing when she said that line, and they had to explain to me why it was funnier in Spanish.
It is, it's funny.
Well, I had an interesting moment in the audience. People walked into it, with this respect for Shakespeare.
Yes.
And then a guy in front of me said, hey, this is funny. But he said it in Spanish,
People are surprised that Hamlet is funny.
Well, that Shakespeare is funny. The thing about the humor in Shakespeare had a brilliant sense of humor. The man was in love with language and the sound of words and fun and very playful, very sexual a lot of the time. He was not afraid to be coarse and vulgar as well as highfalutin. Monty Python is the direct descendant of Shakespeare. They are the direct descendants of that sense of humor. That combination of intelligence and wicked subversive humor, that is really Shakespeare. And we get caught up in a reverence that is actually, he would have loathed. I'm convinced.
That is exactly the next
one. That film Shakespeare in Love. I think Tom Hanks was so young and and how small the theater was.
How small the theater was.
And it was funny. There was so much funny.
So much fun, and it was, and a lot of sexiness. Young people went. I mean, the theaters were really distrusted because that's where young people went to meet. That's where boys met girls, and got out of the influence of their parents, and so on. They were very sexy places, the theaters, and London was really much more like a Mediterranean city in his day. It was not Victoria's London. It was a wild and crazy and very thrilling and exciting place. A lot of cultural influences going on. The language was in flux. I mean, English there was no dictionary, there was no correct grammar, there was no record of what it should be. 25% of the words in his plays, he made up. He made them up. made up the words. It's 25% of them.
It's incredible.
No record of 25% of his words existing in any other context until his plays. Well, that kind of wild imaginative energy, it's our responsibility to tap into that, not into academic correctness, but into that spirit that produced them in the first place.
And I think that's one of the really important things about doing this in Spanish. You know, you've talked about as an Australian and your relationship with the English can be very protective of their Shakespeare. And you've talked about this reference, for example, but you say that Shakespeare belongs to everyone. Was that sort of a catalyst and a litmus for being able to take this project forward?
And kind of, it's also about English. English is the most open of the great languages. English is not protective about shutting influences out. We're constantly allowing new words in and new ways of speaking. If you think of the technology of computers, how that has been embraced into the way, the word text, how that has become a verb. Texting. That was grammatically impossible to say 50 years ago. That would be like a baby speaking badly. But it is now a university, and even the French are forced to use the word texting, which they have. They're very protective of the language. English is not precious, it's absorbing. It takes everything in. That's why the English dictionary is 2 or 3 times larger than any other single dictionary in the world. English has 500,000 words, whereas most other languages only have 100,000. So it's a very absorbing and brilliant thing. But Shakespeare, as a poet, as an artist, his stories are universal. He invented a way of thinking and getting a grip on the world that belongs to all of us. He was, in fact, Australian. And I know a number of you have heard him say that. But now, as of last night, it turns out he was Cuban.
He was Cuban.
No, but I think you brought up something very, very important, the fact that it is something that should be shared with everybody.
Yeah.
No matter what race, color, ethnicity. You were there last night. 2 gentlemen from Mexico.
I met them.
Very, very old men. I'd have to say they were in their late 80s.
Yes.
It's not that old, my dad would say. He was 86.
Comparative, yes, but
one of them who
didn't speak a word of English.
Didn't speak a single word of English and said to me, "Thank you so much for showing me what Shakespeare is, because I have never heard it, read it, or seen it."
Wow.
What do you say back to that?
I had a woman say to me, "I wish I had seen this when I was young, because then I would have appreciated Shakespeare more." So that was exciting, because I know with young people, a lot of times you think it's the most boring thing on the planet, Shakespeare. And she found it alive, and that, of course, is the greatest compliment you can have as an actor, that somebody didn't fall asleep while they were watching it.
Andy and Mercedes, I'm curious, do you feel a certain responsibility of by doing this in Spanish, and how do you feel about, doing something, because we've opened this up to newer audiences, no doubt, and do you feel sort of anything, was there a pressure for you by doing something like this, and how do you feel now that you've had 2 amazing audiences, so I'm just curious what sort of responsibility you felt by doing something like this in Spanish.
Mercedes?
No, you go. Formulate my thought on that one.
Yeah, you do. I don't want to think it like that. I don't want to think like that.
Right.
Because then I get in my head.
I don't feel any responsibility.
But I do feel somewhat of a responsibility, especially, for example, today when we did a matinee for, what was it, 500 kids?
Yeah, they loved it.
Yeah, and I would really bet money that many of them have never seen Shakespeare in Spanish.
Yeah, I would bet you a lot.
So that in itself is a responsibility, in order, because we had Americans and I'm not going to say Americans, but English-speaking and Spanish-speaking kids in the house, and it's a matter of trying to get the story across using the language and the acting as well.
Well, for me, I felt the same responsibility in Spanish that I feel in English, which is to be clear, so that they know what I'm saying. I want someone in the last row to go, "Oh God, I can hear her. I know what she's saying. I'm so excited." Especially the harder the language in a play. Obviously, I want them to feel the emotions of the characters and follow the story. But because I'm a story inhabiter, which they think about this, they call actors storytellers. I feel like I inhabit a story. I want to inhabit it so much that they are drawn in, and especially that they know what I'm saying so they can be drawn in.
It's been an interesting how people have reacted to it in Spanish. We have had a number of, important thinkers and so on, leaders in the Cuban-American community have come to see the play. And one of them, who runs the Cuba Institute in Miami, had a very strong reaction to seeing it in Spanish and felt very strongly that he was Hamlet, that this was his story, that he's now in his 60s and he left Cuba as a young man and felt so powerfully moved by what was going on. And he saw Gertrude as Cuba. He said, Gertrude is Cuba. Cuba is a woman, and she has betrayed me. She made the wrong choice.
Right, and Claudius was Fidel Castro.
Claudius was Fidel Castro, and he feels that pain and hurt that his mother made the wrong choice when he was a young man. So this story was deeply personal for him, and because it was in Spanish, he was very not prepared to be so personally implicated in the event. And I think I think until he saw it, it was an interesting idea,
right.
and was not ready.
Which shows how much the person
to be affected so deeply inside. And he was. I saw him at the intermission, and his eyes were filled with tears, and he said, "I'm not ready to feel this, but I am Hamlet." And the thing about Frankie's Hamlet, the truth is, we're all Hamlet. I mean, this young boy dealing with the death of his father and obsessed with death and figuring out who he is and what it is to be a man. Frankie, I think, somehow has enabled everyone to recognize themselves in him. And that is what Shakespeare gave us. He kind of invented a character. This is a fictional character. Came out of Shakespeare's imagination. But I think many people probably feel they know Hamlet better than they do many people in their lives. They know this boy, they know how he thinks, they know how he feels, they understand something about him. You say the word Hamlet, almost no one on the planet has no clue who he is or was. They've got some idea that this fiction occupies a real space in our sense of who we are.
My mother calls me Hamlet all the time. In Spain, eres una Hamleta. Eres un Hamleto. Una Hamleta means you can't make up your mind.
Can't make up your mind. Yeah.
Stop being such a Hamleta.
Yes.
She says it to me all the time. It's actually become a noun.
I know, and so I find people want to say, I am Hamlet, which is...
And this is why I think it's extremely important that you take it to Havana as well. To see, Andy Gomez sees himself from Miami as Hamlet.
He said to me, everybody, it's exactly what he said, they're all going to feel this is their story. You said to me last night, trying to make me cry.
I did not try to make you cry.
It's very easy, by the way. The boss of the city.
Like, darling, please don't
make me cry. Oh, I have water.
Well, what did you say? You said this is your story.
I said thank you for sharing the story about my country.
Well, I think when we talk about how this is certainly universal and how there's so much identity that we see in this, Johannes and Michael, I'm curious,